Ladies and gentlemen, brace yourselves. Donald Trump is shaking up Washington like never before, taking on the bloated bureaucracy head-on. But there's one final move he must make to drain the swamp for good. And it's probably not what you think. Let's start with what Trump has already done. His administration is one of the only in recent history to reduce the federal workforce. He froze hiring for many agencies, cut positions, and pushed for early retirements. Some employees were offered buyouts worth up to 8 months of pay to just leave. Not bad, right? He also issued executive orders making it easier to fire underperforming federal employees, something unheard of in DC's cushy bureaucratic system. This had a real impact. Under Trump, the size of the federal workforce is beginning to shrink, and morale among the bureaucratic elite plummeted, which, let's be honest, is a pretty good sign he was doing something right. But there's still one massive problem. Even if you reduce the number of federal employees, they're all still in the same place. Washington, D.C. Washington is a bubble, and not just a political one. The city hoards power, money, and influence like a greedy dragon sitting on a mountain of taxpayer gold. Here's a shocking statistic. 4 of the 7 richest counties in America are in the Washington, D.C. metro area, not in Silicon Valley, not in Wall Street, in the town where public servants live. How does that happen? Simple. These bureaucrats regulate the country but never experience what real Americans deal with. They never leave their echo chamber where the answer to every problem is always more government, more spending, more control. And let's talk about groupthink. Federal employees marry each other. They only talk to other federal workers. They live in communities where nearly everyone is a bureaucrat or a consultant working for bureaucrats. How do you expect these people to make sane policies when they've never had to live under the very regulations they impose on the rest of us? Trump made real progress in cutting the federal workforce, but let's be honest, until we break up the swamp's geographic monopoly, the problem isn't going away. So here's the plan. Relocate federal agencies across the country, placing bureaucrats where they might actually learn something about the industries they regulate. The answer is obvious, and Trump can make it happen. It's time to break up the DC monopoly and send these agencies where they belong. In the age of remote work, there's no reason for these massive bureaucracies to all be in one place. Let's move them closer to the industries and communities they actually affect. Here's how it could work. Department of Agriculture, Des Moines, Iowa. Why keep the Department of Agriculture in Washington where nobody knows a thing about farming? Iowa is the heart of American agriculture. If you're making policy decisions about farming, you should be near actual farmers. Department of Energy, Houston, Texas. Want to regulate energy? Move the Department of Energy to the energy capital of the world. Houston is home to America's biggest oil and gas companies, the heart of the nation's petrochemical industry, and even major players in renewable energy. Why on earth would this department stay in Washington, where the closest thing to an energy expert is a guy who installs solar panels in Arlington? Department of Education, Nashville, Tennessee. Tired of the one-size-fits-all education policies forced on America's schools? Let's move the Department of Education out of DC and into a place that actually values school choice and innovation. Nashville is home to some of the country's most interesting education initiatives and would put the department closer to real teachers and parents. Move Department of Transportation to Atlanta, Georgia. DC is not a transportation hub. Atlanta is, so let's move the Department of Transportation there. With one of the busiest airports in the world and a massive interstate network, Atlanta actually understands infrastructure challenges. Maybe if our transportation bureaucrats lived there, we wouldn't have trillion-dollar infrastructure bills that somehow don't fix roads. Department of the Interior to Denver, Colorado. The Department of the Interior manages public lands, national parks, and Native American affairs, and yet it's headquartered in Washington? Why? Move it to Denver, close to the vast public lands and tribal nations it's supposed to serve. Department of Veterans Affairs to San Antonio, Texas. San Antonio has one of the largest concentrations of veterans in the country. If we want the VA to actually serve veterans rather than itself, let's put it where it will be surrounded by the people it exists to help. The Department of Commerce, Charlotte, North Carolina. Charlotte is a financial powerhouse and home to major banking and business hubs. Let's move the Department of Commerce there so it can actually work with the people who drive economic growth. The Department of Homeland Security, El Paso, Texas. Think it's a good idea to have the agency responsible for border security based in Washington, D.C.? No. Send it to El Paso, right on the front lines of the border crisis. Maybe if DHS employees actually had to see the consequences of bad policies, we'd get fewer of them. The Department of Health and Human Services, Indianapolis, Indiana. Indianapolis is a major hub for medical research, pharmaceuticals, and healthcare innovation. Why not put HHS where the action is instead of keeping it in a city where the only thing they regulate is government paperwork? Want to focus on blue-collar jobs and economic opportunity? Move the Department of Labor to Pittsburgh, a city with a long history of industry, manufacturing, and worker training. Department of the Treasury, New York, New York. This one is obvious. The Department of the Treasury oversees money, banking, and financial markets. Where should it be? In New York, the financial capital of the world. Department of Housing and Urban Development, Los Angeles, California. If there's one city in America that could use better housing policies, it's Los Angeles. Maybe if HUD employees had to walk through Skid Row on their way to work, they'd finally stop throwing taxpayer money at failed urban planning ideas. We'll let DC keep one thing, the State Department. Fine, they can keep the State Department. Let them have their cocktail parties with foreign dignitaries. But everything else? We're moving it out. The big question, will Trump do it? Trump has always been a disruptor, and there's nothing more disruptive than breaking up the DC cartel. He's already shown himself to be willing to make waves against the bloated federal government, but this should be a top priority. But what do you think? Would breaking up the federal agencies finally drain the swamp, or would these bureaucrats just bring their nonsense to new places? And where would you relocate these departments? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more common sense conservatism, delivered direct.